So, you're on the internet one day doing some research maybe on how to make charcoal, how to salt your deer hide, how to graft or something, and you end up watching a video of some guy in the woods swinging an axe. About 10 minutes later, you're like, why am I still watching this? And before you know it, the Tom Sawyer effect starts kicking in and you wish you were out there swinging that axe. And before you know it, you have a new interest and you're like, Steven, you bastard, I didn't need a new hobby, but of course you do, right? Let's face it, fixing the car, barbecuing, are no longer enough. You need to add axes and axemanship to the arsenal in your manly skill set. And what's more manly and elemental than hanging out in the woods, swinging a sharp thing on the end of a stick and hitting stuff? If there's two things dudes like, or three things really, it's sticks, sharp things, and hitting stuff. So we get to combine all three. Hell yeah, sign me up. And of course, the next logical question is which axe to start with. And this really is one of the most commonly asked questions. I get this all the time on social media, on Patreon, by email, of course YouTube comments. Well, it turns out that the axe that I most want to use all the time and would just generally recommend is also the axe I would recommend that most people start with. So let's dig into the whats and more importantly the whys of what a good axe to start with is. So there's two possible questions here. One is what brand/model should I buy? And the other one is essentially what are the specifications or design of a good axe. The second of those, specification and design, is obviously the most important. One says go buy this, we're done, there's no more discussion. The other one is like, what do you want to look for in general? What if you're putting an axe together? What if you're at the flea market or something like that? So obviously we're going to spend most of our time on general design and specifications, but I will have some recommendations at the end. So the first question we want to ask is, what are you going to use the axe for? Now I'm going to divide this into three categories, not that there wouldn't be more, but three common categories, which is trekking, splitting, and general purpose. We're going to talk mostly today about general purpose, but I just want to address the other two real quick. If you're mostly putting up wood for your wood stove, like chainsawed wood, and you're splitting that in your yard, you want a full-size axe with like a full-size long handle. And I wouldn't sharpen it for chopping, I would just leave it as a splitter. And anyone with any kind of axe, I mean, if you do that kind of work, you should just have one or two dedicated axes for that anyway. So for trekking, like if you actually have to pack the thing around a lot, you want something light. I would go under 2 pounds for the head, probably about 1 3/4-ish or something like that. And on a slightly shorter handle, but not a super short handle. Now this is just personal preference to me. I don't like handles, like my hard limit is kind of 25 inches. Under that, I just start to get really annoyed. When they get really stubby and right in between, they're just kind of awkward and dangerous. They don't really function well as a full-sized axe to do a lot of general work. They'll suffice, like you can kind of make them work, but they're clumsy and awkward and weird to use. So I'm either going to go with 25 inch to 26 inches, 26 is going to be my preference, or I'm just going to go all the way down to a 16-inch hatchet, 16 inches from here to here, and just a regular kind of lightweight like this, basically a belt axe, something you can tuck in your belt and it won't pull your pants down too easy. That's just my personal preference. The models that most people get in that category are the Grand Swords Brooks Forest Axe, the bigger one. I would recommend the bigger one, or the Husqvarna multi-purpose Forest Axe. Now let's talk about the important category to me, which is an axe that will do pretty much everything or a little bit of everything. Now again, if you go out into different extremes or say, well, like this isn't the best axe for splitting wood or something like that, sure, you can make that argument, but I'm talking about an all-around kind of a compromise that works really well. And that's going to be a 2 1/4 to 2 3/4 pound axe on a 28-inch handle. Now if you're quite a bit like bigger and taller than average or smaller than average, I would consider, maybe modifying that a little bit. But there's a reason that axe is really common, and that's because it's kind of a sweet spot that will work for almost everyone. And it's just pretty much just right for kind of like average guys. I would also recommend that that's a pole axe, so a single bit with a flat pole here. The other option, of course, is a double bit axe. And these are cool, and what's really cool is they often come in 2.5 pounds, which I would more recommend than a 2 1/4 pound, and these are usually 2 1/4 pound. This one isn't, it's actually 2.5, but there's a number of things here. But first of all, the pole is handy, but the main thing is that these are just a lot more dangerous. They're dangerous to have laying around. You can't, if you stick them in a stump, then one edge is always sticking up. They're dangerous to just like carry around. in the woods, and that includes like while you're working, there's brush and it's all tangly. If you fall, then you could fall on the bit. And they're a little more dangerous while they're in use. So for all those reasons, I just recommend starting with a pole axe. These are really cool. If you happen to have one laying around, if you happen to run into one cheap, yeah, go for it. I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker, but I would recommend if you're going to buy something or seek something out, just start with a pole axe. So if I were to recommend any one thing, it's going to be a 28-inch handle with a 2.5-pound head. 28-inch handle is kind of a misnomer because that's the measure of the raw handle. By the time the head's on it and it's cut off, it's usually more like 27 inches. That's totally fine. Now the head weight, usually these are 2.25 pounds, this size of axe. There aren't that many 2.5 pounds, which is unfortunate. It's not a big deal, but if I were to actually design an axe like this, I'd make it 2.5 pounds. That's just kind of my sweet spot. But most of them are 2.25, and that's totally fine. I've actually done a lot more chopping with 2.25-pound axes because they're so common. And it's not like when I'm out there with this 2.5-pound axe, I'm just like, oh my God, it's so much better to have this extra 1/4 pound. So go ahead and start with what you can find in this range, and you can always, add a 2.5 if you find one later. Now for the axe length, there's an old test of grabbing the head like this and tucking it into your armpit, and if you can do that, that's kind of like a good size for general purpose work. But a little bit over and under that shouldn't make a real gigantic difference or anything. So this type of axe has the unfortunate moniker of boys' axe, which is too bad because they're not just for boys, and it kind of implies, it's kind of diminishing, and it kind of implies that they're not real tools. They're very definitely real working tools. They do real work. In some ways they're superior, in other ways they may fall short under some circumstances, but as a general purpose tool, this is what I want to be using in the woods almost all the time. I have very little use for full-size axes. Personally, I like them when I'm splitting. If this happens to be laying there, I'm probably just going to grab this and use it, but if I'm going to do like a lot of splitting or I'm grabbing from a selection of axes, I'll probably grab a full-size axe. But otherwise, for the most part, for most jobs in chopping in smaller wood, especially, which is what most of us are going to do, how many people out there are going to be chopping even like 2-foot diameter trees down, let alone 4-foot or 6-foot? So while any axe is a compromise, and there is no perfect knife, there is no perfect axe, these are not a compromise in very many ways, and don't make the mistake of thinking that they won't do real work, because someone who's experienced with one will prove you otherwise. I hear back from way more people, quite a few people, that they switched to trying a smaller axe and really like it. Compared to the number of people, which I can only think of one, who were like, yeah, I tried that and it didn't really work out for me. I like my heavy axe. So anyway, you can always tweak and experiment later, but it'll give you like a starting place and a benchmark. And these axes are common and popular for a reason. All right, let's talk about the whys. We'll start with length. So this is just more maneuverable than a long axe. If you're working in the woods, just, kind of handling the axe, there's brush, there's limbs if you're limbing a tree that's down. There's situations where you might have like a tightly spaced trees, really close together, and a short axe is more maneuverable and more usable in tight spaces. When you're just carrying it in the woods, it's just easier to carry a short axe. Even transporting the axe, like sticking it in the front of the car, sticking it in the back of the car, it's all just easier, more convenient with a short axe. In both general handling and especially in one-handed use, the extra length and weight of a longer handle causes an inertia drag back here that's really kind of annoying and limiting. So even with this axe, when I'm using it with one hand like this, I'm constantly fighting this inertia. I'm fighting it to get the thing started, and I'm fighting it at the end to stop it. So having a shorter, lighter handle, and also this is a good reason to tune your handles up and thin them down, makes it just easier to handle with one hand, and also just when you're handling the axe in general, kind of like between work. A major consideration is bucking ergonomics. So I don't like trying to buck vertical faces with a full-size axe. I'm either going to step back and buck into like what would be the top corner of the log, kind of at like this angle, or I'm going to have to like get up on the thing and try to kind of choke up on the axe or like lift my hands a little bit. It's just awkward. It doesn't feel right. It's not very ergonomic. Now, some people complain about having to bend over using a small axe for bucking like that. I just honestly haven't had a big problem with that. If that's a problem for you, I would either use a longer axe because you're taller, if that's the problem, or work on your posture and body mechanics. And I'd recommend the Go Clay method for that. But personally for me, that isn't a problem. The problem is getting a longer axe and having it be awkward and having to adapt or step back or something like that. But the take-home message is if you're standing right up on a log, which is my preference, I'll actually usually, especially with small logs, I'll have my toes against the back of the log. I want this length of handle to buck vertical notches. And I want to buck vertical notches because then I can buck one vertical notch, step to the other side, buck another vertical notch without moving the log at all, and then just kick it part way over and sever the last cut. And finally, there's accuracy. So a shorter handle is just a little easier to be accurate with, right? The longer the handle, imagine trying to chop a tree down with a 10-foot handle and how hard it would be to hit the target. Because if you just move your hands even just a little bit, that's amplified way out the end of the axe. So the longer the axe is, the more any deviations that you make add up. Now, that's not to say that a long handle is a deal breaker or a long handle, you can't learn to use a long handle. I'm just saying it's a factor, and especially for beginners, it's more of a factor because it's just easier to be accurate with a short axe. Okay, so for weight, first of all, it's easier to be accurate with an axe that's not way too heavy or way too light. Like really super light axes can be a little awkward, and it's so light that it's easy to steer the axe wrong. It's really easy. And really heavy axes can just be hard to use and hard to be accurate with. So it's not a huge big deal, but there is a kind of a sweet range in there, and this is pretty good for that. Obviously, you can lift this axe all day long. The heavier the axe is, the more work it takes in just kind of like general handling of the axe. So when you're walking around, when you're maneuvering the axe, if you set it down and have to pick it back up, when you pick it up to do your swing or whatever. Obviously, if a light axe and a heavy axe are traveling at the same speed, the heavy axe is going to hit with more authority, but that picture is much more complicated than just that simple statement. Lighter axes require more speed in use, but they are also easier to swing, and they're easier in general handling. You should find the thing that works for you and feels good that you can work with for long periods of time. So one-handed use, again with the inertia out here, when you're using the axe with one hand, having less weight out here is really beneficial. Like you can really feel the drag back there. And these are very usable with one hand though, because they're light enough. You can be reasonably accurate and do reasonably good work with them, but the more you start to scale this up, the more challenging that's going to be. The harder it is to lift with one hand, the harder it is to aim often, or kind of like maneuver and steer the axe where you want it to go. Once it goes through, you have to stop it. So if it's really heavy, you could be like, trying to stop the thing. And I use axes one-handed all the time. Part of the reason is because I use these light axes and I'm just used to it. It's pretty amazing though, actually, how much I use an axe with one hand, especially in limbing. Often it's awkward to kind of like use two hands and hack some like limb down here on the other side of the tree when I can just like sit here and just pop, branches off like that. So to me, that's really important. And, if I need to do some carving or chop out a wedge or something like that, I just want a light axe to use for that. And, just that, and generally like maneuvering and handling are really important to me. I'm like always playing with my tools. If you watch my videos, I'm always doing this kind of thing and slinging the stuff around. I try to be real efficient in the way that I handle my axe while I'm working, right? I'm usually choked up here where it's like real easy to carry and real easy to maneuver. And that's all real important to me. So that for me, that's like a really specific, important thing that I miss when I pick up a larger axe, and I'm kind of like, it just feels clumsy and heavy and awkward. Kind of like the difference between a sports car and like an old American boat, Oldsmobile kind of car. Okay, so let's talk about the downsides. They're more dangerous. And the reason is because the shorter handle just puts you in more danger of the bit hitting you versus the ground. So if there's some margin there where like you're splitting a piece on the ground and a large axe would stick in the ground and this axe might stick in your foot or your ankle. That is a very real danger, and especially I would say in splitting, you need to be extra careful when you're splitting with a short axe. It is possible to use them safely, but let's face it, they're dangerous and anyone can make a mistake, and it's that much more dangerous to use a short axe. But you have to weigh that against all the other stuff I just, said. That's the thing that would most make me want to possibly unrecommend an axe in this length, but it's not enough. So, chopping down huge trees. If you're chopping the trees down, you have to get pretty big before it's going to be like, oh damn, I really need a big axe. That's not likely to be a problem. Now, when you're bucking large trees, at some point you're just reaching too far. You're having to lean way down and reach too far with a short axe. So then you're going to maybe want a big axe. But remember, this doesn't have to be your last axe. It's going to be your first axe and quite possibly your main axe, I would guess. But you can always just, add some more axes to the arsenal over time. But starting with a full-size axe on a long handle, not recommended. I just can't recommend it for all those reasons. So what are your options? What do you actually get? One thing I would not get, and I'm only saying this because so many people ask, is the Hudson Bay axe. I started with the Hudson Bay axe. It was my first axe. I have a whole story about my love affair and breakup with Hudson Bay axes. I'm really not a fan, and I just can't recommend them. Also, they don't fit the specifications that I just said. This is probably under 2 pounds. This one's especially a small one, but I don't like this shallow eye. Just causes a lot of problems with the handle coming loose and breaking. It's not particularly an efficient chopper. Really what I feel like this is it's an improved tomahawk, and I just don't think it's a very great axe. So a lot of people sell this kind of classic 2 1/4 pound boy's axe on a 28-inch handle, but most axes now are junk. The people who manufacture them don't use them at all. They don't understand the tools. They're just trying to make money. They're taking advantage of an uneducated market who just doesn't know or understand axes anymore and will pretty much buy anything. So the company in America that doesn't fit that description, or fits that description the least, like the large company aside from small boutique makers, is Council Tool. So this is the new Council Tool Sport Utility model boy's axe. This is the classic like red budget one that I've recommended a lot. These don't seem to be as cheap as they used to. I don't know if they're phasing it out or something, but given any like marginal price difference in the range of like 15 bucks or so, I would go with this. These do have a lot of problems with quality control. I think one of the things they're aiming to fix with this one is just a little better quality control in the steel, tempering and all that stuff. Now there is one more, the Forest Service version, which I thought I had here, but I don't see. And it's almost identical. Like, these don't really vary that much in their specifications. This actually comes like relatively sharp, and you could use it out of the box. I would definitely not consider this a good chopping edge myself. I mean, I would do a lot of work to this. And this is the thing about buying any new axe, is that you're still going to have to do a whole bunch of work to it. So my main recommendation is actually to buy a used head and put it on a handle, or a used axe with a handle if you happen to find one. That could be intimidating because maybe you don't have the skill set, you don't know what to do with it. Well, if you get a new axe, it's going to need a lot of the same work anyway. And you can't do axes and axemanship without a whole set of skills, and that includes replacing handles, tightening handles, setting the axe up to chop well in the first place, maintaining it, sharpening it. So you can't really, there is no out-of-the-box solution anyway. And if you spend a ton of money, let's say you spend tons of money and you actually get an axe from someone who actually sets the thing up well to chop in the first place, it can get damaged. You have to sharpen it, regrind it. I mean, there's just stuff. So it's not that kind of thing, and you might as well learn that now by just getting a used head and putting a handle on it. So this is like $55 shipped, I think, on Amazon or something like that. I can't remember for sure, but the red one seems to be about the same price now. It used to be a lot cheaper. So here's an example of a vintage head put on a handle. I'll be right back. Let me grab a handle. So here's a handle I picked up at my local hardware store. The brand is Do It or Do It Best. I'm quite sure this company does not make their own axe handles, so they're relabeling this, which means that there's more of these out there, probably under different labels at different hardware stores in different parts of the country. This is a nice traditional handle. It's not ridiculously thick. Like, I could actually put a head on this and get away with using it and not whine too much, but I'm going to thin it down and fix it quite a bit. But anyway, it's not unworkable, and it's not like a ton of work to fix it, and everything else is great about it. In fact, this is this same handle when it's put on and tuned up the way I like it. I think this was 12 bucks out the door, so if you can get a free or cheap or even just reasonably priced small head and put it on there, you'll have a nice vintage axe. Now in Europe, I would probably go with the Holzbruchs or Hultafors Calyx axe. That's the equivalent of one of these, boys' axes, same specifications. You're probably going to have pretty thin cheeks on that, but these actually are pretty thin too. Like the modern trend seems to be more towards scooping out a lot of meat in the cheeks right here and leaving just, the meat like right at the edge here. Probably the worst case I've seen of that is Groundsfor's, at least the Forest axe, where it's just super thin back here and there's just this little strip of meat at the front. I tend to kind of favor the old American axes that have like a lot of meat on them, or people call it like a high center line axe. I usually end up filing most of that off anyway, but I kind of favor either that or a wedge axe. Like this is a wedge right here, a perfect wedge. I wouldn't worry about that stuff too much. It's not going to make some huge difference of like whether the tool works or not, so you're fine buying a council tool. I'm sure the Holzbruch. Just at this point in my evolution, I kind of favor either, kind of like wedge axes or axes with fat cheeks, and I can take stuff off. Like if I want to take stuff off, I can take stuff off, but if it's already gone, I can't put it back. Now if Hultafors was cheaper here, I would probably be recommending those more, but in the States they're like twice the price as they are in Europe. So in Europe, I think the equivalent price would be very similar to like a council tool or something like that. This video here has some information on using light axes and basically like speed versus mass, heavy axes versus light axes and that sort of stuff. Important information for using a light axe. I will put Amazon affiliate links to both the council tool and the Holzbruchs in the description.